It began on an ordinary evening in October 1995. The small town of Maple Hollow, Alabama, sat quiet under the fading light. On the edge of town, a two-story house with pale shutters drew the attention of local police after a neighbor noticed the front porch light still on well into the night. When officers arrived, nothing outside seemed disturbed. The yard was still, the mailbox closed, and the door locked as if everything inside was safe. With a key provided by family, they stepped in. Inside, they found 24-year-old Emily Carter seated in a wooden chair by the living room window. She was motionless, her head gently resting back. At first glance, there were no signs of violence, no struggle across the carpet, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. Her jewelry remained in place, and her purse sat on a side table with cash untouched. The officers quickly realized they were not dealing with a burglary. The silence carried weight. It was the kind of scene that left more questions than answers, a place where time itself seemed to have paused. The unanswered questions started from the very first hour. When police looked closer, the details deepened the mystery. Every lock was secured from the inside, including the front latch and the small bolt on the kitchen door. Windows were closed firmly, screens intact, no sign that anyone had tampered with them. Drawers sat neatly shut, valuables lined in place, and even a set of silver coins on the mantel had not been touched. Investigators dusted for prints, but found only those belonging to Emily and her immediate family, who often visited. The surfaces were clean in a way that suggested normal household care, not recent wiping or staging. Officers noted that the air was still, the clock ticking steadily in the background, as if nothing had ever interrupted the room. The longer they looked, the more the absence of disturbance defined the case. They expected broken locks, scattered items, or some mark of forced entry. Instead, they had the opposite, a room that offered no struggle, no noise, no alarm. This contrast left officers unsettled. It was a crime scene without clues, a quiet home holding its silence. But absence can speak louder than presence. By sunrise, the questions spread beyond the home. A medical examiner conducted the first assessment and reported no immediate sign of trauma. There were no wounds, no visible bruises, and no bleeding that could explain sudden death. Toxicology samples were taken, but results would take time. Officials could not mark the death as natural, yet they also could not name a cause. For the Carter family, the lack of answers created confusion. Emily had been healthy, active, and committed to her work as a teacher. She had no known illnesses, no reports of fainting or previous collapse. Friends spoke of her steady routines, her calm presence, and her habit of careful planning. Nothing in her life suggested sudden, unexplained loss. Police placed the case under the category of suspicious death. They kept the house sealed for further review, collecting fibers, notes, and every document they could find. The story reached the local paper, where headlines read, "Teacher found dead, no signs of break-in." For many in town, it became a puzzle they could not place. Authorities had facts but not causes, details but not answers. To understand what followed, we need to know who she was. Her story mattered to many. Emily Carter was known not only as a teacher, but also as someone who offered calm reassurance to children just beginning their first years of school. She taught second grade at Maple Hollow Elementary, a red brick building near the town center. Each morning, she walked from her modest home to the school, greeting students with a steady smile. She was the oldest of 3 siblings and the first in her family to graduate from college. Her colleagues recalled her soft voice, the way she spoke with patience, and her ability to settle even the most restless classroom. Outside of work, Emily enjoyed reading and keeping a small garden behind her house. In town, she was not widely social, but known well enough to be recognized at the grocery store or church service. Residents described her as steady, a person who rarely sought attention but was present in dependable ways. For those who knew her, her sudden absence felt impossible to understand. The question was not only how she died, but how such a careful life could stop without warning. And the town she lived in framed that story. Life in 1995 Alabama had its own rhythm. Maple Hollow was a small place of fewer than 6,000 residents. Most families had lived there for generations. The town's economy once relied on cotton mills, but by the mid-90s many had slowed, leaving fewer jobs and a stronger dependence on schools, churches, and local shops. The pace was slow. Neighbors still exchanged greetings from porches. Children rode bikes along quiet streets. On weekends, families gathered for high school football or community barbecues. Safety was part of the town's identity. Locking doors at night was common, but many still left them open during the day without concern. The church stood as a central landmark, both spiritual and social. School events filled calendars, and the community leaned heavily on teachers like Emily. Her presence fit naturally into this environment. She was not someone living apart from it, but rather a steady part of the town's fabric. That was what made her loss feel so disruptive. In a place where routines defined daily life, and where people expected continuity, the sudden silence inside her home struck deeply. That rhythm was broken in a single night. The first responses were personal. Colleagues at the elementary school canceled classes for the following day. Teachers placed candles in the staff room, and her desk remained untouched. Students were told gently, though many were too young to grasp the meaning of her absence. Neighbors organized a small vigil, lining the street outside her home with candles. It was not dramatic, but quiet, lasting only an hour before the crowd dispersed into the cool evening. At the grocery store where she had shopped only days earlier, employees placed flowers near the entrance. The local newspaper printed its account on the front page. The headline read, "A mystery with no intruder." It noted that nothing appeared taken, no locks broken, and no alarms triggered. For readers, the phrase captured what many already felt. The absence of cause was itself the central puzzle. People in Maple Hollow were used to reading about accidents, illnesses, or the occasional burglary. This case did not fit those patterns. It carried a weight of uncertainty that left conversations unfinished. Grief sat alongside confusion. For the town, the event marked a shift. But soon, attention shifted to the timeline of her final day. Her final hours were simple, even ordinary. On that Monday, October 23rd, Emily arrived at Maple Hollow Elementary at 7:30 in the morning. She taught a full day of classes, finishing with a meeting where colleagues discussed lesson plans for the following month. She left the building at 4:15 in the afternoon, carrying a folder and a grocery list. Surveillance from a small market downtown showed her entering at 5:05. She purchased bread, milk, and vegetables. The receipt timestamp matched what police later collected. At 6 o'clock, a neighbor recalled seeing her wave as she walked from the car to her porch. She carried a single bag and appeared calm. These were the last confirmed sightings of Emily alive. Every detail pointed to a normal day, free of tension or distress. No missed calls, no unexpected visitors, and no reports of argument or noise. The hours ticked by in measured order. This was the pattern that investigators later traced again and again, searching for what might have been overlooked. Routine, repetition, and nothing alarming. Yet somewhere in those hours, everything changed. Records show her last contact. At 7:10 p.m., Emily made a brief phone call to a colleague. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. She confirmed a time for a meeting later in the week. Her tone was calm, and nothing about the call raised concern. That colleague later testified that Emily sounded, as she always did, normal and clear. Phone company logs confirmed no additional outgoing or incoming calls from her landline that evening. There were no long gaps of ringing, no messages left on her answering machine. The last note in the phone log stood out simply because it was final. Police also checked her bank records. There was no unusual activity, no transactions that hinted at an unplanned trip or expense. Her evening appeared as uneventful as any other weekday. For investigators, this phone call became an anchor point in her timeline. It showed she was home, safe, and in control of her schedule. But after that moment, the record went silent. Nothing further was heard from Emily Carter. After that, only silence. Inside her home, signs of routine offered more questions than answers. The television was switched on but muted, as if she had lowered the sound while making a call. A lamp in the corner was lit, the curtains drawn, and her grocery bag was placed neatly on the kitchen counter. In the living room, a book rested on the arm of a chair. A glass of water sat half full on the side table. These were not signs of distress, but of someone continuing with their evening. Investigators noticed that the back door was locked with its bolt, a task Emily often completed early. Every detail suggested she had settled in for the night. There were no signs that she expected visitors or that she prepared to leave again. The atmosphere inside the house reflected calm order. And yet, by the next day, that order had collapsed into mystery. Family, concerned when she did not appear at school, made the first calls to police. What they would discover upon entering was far from routine. The search began almost immediately. Police began with the basics. Entry points. Officers rechecked every lock, latch, and window. They confirmed that both front and back doors had been secured from the inside. The small windows in the kitchen and hallway were closed tight, without scratches or pry marks. The garage door was shut, its chain intact, and no footprints appeared in the dust on its floor. Investigators walked the perimeter of the yard, examining soft soil and grass. No impression stood out. Rain had fallen 2 days earlier, but even damp ground offered no clear shoe prints or tire tracks. The gates to the backyard fence were closed from the inside, consistent with how Emily typically left them. They then turned to her belongings. Her car keys rested in a dish by the door, her wallet and driver's license inside her purse. Nothing appeared moved or disturbed. Jewelry on her dresser remained in place. Even her mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter, collected earlier that day. The more they searched, the less they found. It was a scene that gave no opening for theories. With no sign of intrusion, the investigation had to turn toward the details of her final hours. Attention shifted to the neighborhood. Officers canvassed homes on Emily's street, asking residents whether they saw or heard anything unusual. The responses were consistent. Most described a quiet night, no loud arguments, and no traffic beyond the normal evening comings and goings. One neighbor recalled hearing the faint sound of a television from Emily's house around 8 o'clock. Another mentioned passing by at 9 and noticing the porch lights still glowing, which was common. None reported visitors, deliveries, or suspicious movement. Police checked utility logs. Electric use matched her routine, with lights and appliances running in typical patterns. Water usage showed a brief spike at 6:30, likely when she prepared dinner, and nothing afterward. Investigators also reviewed local call records. No emergency calls came from the neighborhood that evening. Patrol units noted no unusual activity on nearby streets. The absence of external events was striking. In most investigations, someone hears a disturbance, a car, or even a dog barking at the wrong time. Here, the silence of the community mirrored the silence of the house. The search then shifted inward to her workplace and closest connections, in hopes of uncovering overlooked details. Detectives met with colleagues at Maple Hollow Elementary. Staff confirmed her punctuality, her steady manner, and her absence of visible stress in recent weeks. She had been preparing for parent conferences, creating lesson outlines, and had shared no concerns about personal safety. Her principal described her as reliable. She rarely called in sick, never left meetings abruptly, and was not known to bring personal matters into work. Coworkers checked her desk and found neatly arranged lesson plans dated for the following days. Nothing suggested she anticipated a sudden absence. They also reviewed her relationships. Friends said Emily was private, rarely socializing outside small circles. She had no current partner, and her last known relationship had ended amicably months earlier. No recent disputes were noted. The school provided her calendar, which police added to the timeline. It reinforced the view of steady routine. There were no canceled meetings, no last-minute changes. This investigation step gave officials a clearer picture of Emily's life, but little that explained her death. The more they learned, the more the focus returned to evidence inside her home. Forensics would now take the lead. The county forensic team conducted a detailed sweep. They collected fibers from carpets, upholstery, and Emily's clothing. Each sample was sealed and logged with chain of custody records. Initial lab tests revealed nothing unusual. The fibers matched household textiles and her own garments. Blood tests showed no visible traces in the house. Luminol applications across floors and walls revealed no hidden stains. Swabs from doorknobs, switches, and handles were analyzed for foreign DNA. None appeared. Only her own prints and those of close family were confirmed. Her body provided limited clues. The medical examiner noted her posture suggested sudden collapse rather than struggle. No defensive marks existed on her arms or hands. Nails were intact, without residue from another person. Toxicology screens were ordered, though they required weeks for processing. The lack of evidence frustrated investigators. Every item collected led back to Emily or her environment. Nothing pointed outward. It was a case where the physical world offered no contradiction to the idea of a locked, undisturbed home. Still, investigators held on to the belief that small details might eventually break the silence. They began rechecking the smallest corners of her daily routine. The autopsy was methodical. Height, weight, and general health markers were noted as stable. Heart, lungs, and major organs showed no abnormalities at first inspection. No bruises or fractures appeared. The absence of trauma eliminated many typical causes of sudden death. Blood samples were screened for common toxins, alcohol, prescription medications, and recreational substances. Initial findings came back negative. Extended panels were requested for rarer compounds. Investigators understood that results might take weeks, but the delay left the case without immediate answers. The examiner did observe one detail: slight congestion in the lungs, which might suggest exposure to a substance or condition not visible through standard testing. It was not conclusive but marked for follow-up. The report listed cause of death as pending further study. This status kept the case open as suspicious, preventing it from being closed as natural or accidental. For detectives, this middle ground created difficulty. Without confirmation, they could not rule out foul play, yet they lacked grounds for charges. It left the case in limbo, forcing reliance on interviews and circumstantial evidence until the lab returned results. Investigators began reviewing documents found in Emily's home. Journals contained lesson ideas, grocery lists, and reminders, but no notes of distress. A checkbook showed consistent entries for bills and groceries. Receipts confirmed purchases made in the days leading up to her death. Her calendar was equally steady. Dates for conferences, family gatherings, and errands filled the weeks ahead. Nothing suggested she anticipated disruption. Even the grocery receipt from her final day matched items found in the kitchen bag, confirming her timeline. Police also examined letters and correspondence. A few holiday cards from family, utility notices, and school memos were present. None suggested conflict. The absence of anomalies stood out. Investigators often expect last-minute notes, sudden changes, or unexplained entries. Here, documents reflected continuity. Attention then shifted to her phone records. Calls matched known contacts, with no unidentified numbers. The 3-minute conversation at 7:10 remained the last entry. Every paper, every record confirmed what witnesses already said. Emily lived a routine, careful life. The mystery grew sharper. It was not only how she died, but how so many normal patterns could end without explanation. The investigation had to press deeper. Police returned to interviews, speaking again with neighbors. One woman across the street recalled seeing Emily's living room lamp still lit at 10 o'clock. Another remembered her car parked in the driveway, unchanged from earlier in the evening. None saw visitors. Detectives also spoke with a postal worker who had delivered mail to her house that afternoon. He described Emily as calm, thanking him politely. He noted no unusual activity in the area. Family members confirmed routine contact. Emily's sister spoke to her by phone the previous weekend, describing her as cheerful. No disagreements or concerns were mentioned. Her parents, living 2 towns away, had expected to see her at a family gathering later that week. The uniformity of accounts left investigators with little variation. Everyone described the same Emily, calm, steady, and uneventful in her last days. No sudden disputes, no arguments overheard. Such uniform testimony created difficulty. Without contradiction, investigators lacked avenues for further questioning. Consistency is usually helpful, but in this case it reinforced the absence of leads. It was another layer of silence surrounding the house. Attention turned to colleagues at the school, who were interviewed more formally. Teachers noted Emily's careful preparation for upcoming parent meetings. Her classroom materials were organized, lesson plans set for the next 2 weeks. One coworker remembered she mentioned grading papers that evening, which matched documents later found at her house. Another recalled Emily briefly discussing books she planned to order for her students. None recalled distress, missed appointments, or sudden changes in tone. Students were too young to provide meaningful testimony, but their parents were asked about recent classroom behavior. They described nothing unusual. Her steady presence remained consistent until her final day. Police also asked if anyone had seen unfamiliar visitors near the school. No such reports emerged. The staff described a calm routine. This round of interviews provided further confirmation of her steady life. Investigators found no signs of conflict at her workplace, no professional disputes, and no indication she felt threatened. The consistency of accounts again narrowed the case. Each confirmation reduced the chance of hidden disputes. The investigation had to reach beyond direct contacts. Detectives extended interviews to wider acquaintances. Library staff confirmed Emily had borrowed books earlier in the month, returning them on time. Store clerks remembered her as polite, making small purchases with no unusual behavior. They also spoke with former classmates and distant relatives. These conversations produced the same picture: a reserved, responsible woman with few conflicts. A distant cousin described her as always dependable, never surprising. The repetition of character sketches frustrated investigators. Cases often hinge on a contradiction. One person recalls anger, another recalls calm. Here, every voice aligned. Still, they documented each account carefully. Even absence of conflict is evidence in its own way. It suggested that if her death involved outside action, it came from someone beyond her normal circles. The wider interviews closed without new leads. Detectives returned to the evidence already collected, awaiting toxicology results and rechecking logs. The case entered a phase of waiting, with files growing but answers absent. This stage created unease in the town. For weeks, the story remained unresolved. With no clear suspect, no cause, and no resolution, uncertainty grew. It would take an unexpected turn to break the silence. The DNA discovery in 2011 finally pointed investigators outward. The profile matched a man who had once lived briefly in Alabama during 1995. His name appeared in employment logs for a construction crew that renovated a highway overpass near Maple Hollow. Records placed him in town for 3 months, overlapping with the period of Emily's death. Detectives built a timeline of his movements. Pay stubs confirmed regular shifts, but no ties to the victim were clear. He had no listed address in the same neighborhood, and no shared acquaintances were identified. Colleagues from that era recalled him as quiet, often keeping to himself. He rented a room in a boarding house 2 miles from Emily's home. After the project ended, he moved to another state. The absence of a direct connection complicated the matter. DNA offered undeniable presence, but not context. Investigators had to prove opportunity and circumstance. This marked the first time in years that the case held momentum. For the first time, someone existed who could be questioned. Suspicion had form, even if faint. The puzzle now extended beyond silence, reaching into the life of a man who had passed through unnoticed. Detectives turned to financial records. With cooperation from out-of-state banks, they traced credit card activity from 1995. One receipt caught attention: a grocery store transaction in Maple Hollow on the same evening Emily shopped. The receipt was logged at 6:45 p.m., only 15 minutes before her neighbors saw her return home. Items purchased were basic: bread, milk, canned goods. Nothing suggested planning for travel or concealment, but the timing was close enough to raise questions. Investigators revisited store records. Clerks from that era could not recall details so many years later, but layout maps showed that checkout counters were positioned so customers might easily see one another. It was possible Emily and the man stood in line at the same time. Such proximity mattered. It did not prove conversation, but it placed him in her environment at a critical moment. Combined with DNA, it became part of a growing narrative. The finding was carefully logged. Investigators knew courts would demand precise timelines. Every receipt, every timestamp, needed corroboration. Still, this discovery narrowed the field further. The man once passing quietly through town was no longer a shadow, but a potential link to her last evening. In 2012, detectives arranged an interview. The man, now in his 40s, lived in another state with steady employment. He agreed to speak voluntarily, perhaps believing the distance of years would protect him. During questioning, he denied ever meeting Emily. He stated he remembered living in Maple Hollow briefly, but insisted he kept to work and had little social contact. He claimed to recall shopping at local stores, but not seeing her. Detectives pressed him on timelines. He admitted to being in town during the fall of 1995, but could not provide specific alibis for evenings. His recollections were vague. He described nights spent at the boarding house, watching television, or resting after work. When shown the grocery receipt, he acknowledged it was possible he had shopped that evening, but denied memory of details. His responses lacked precision. The inconsistencies grew sharper when compared with records. Utility logs from his boarding house showed his keycard used after midnight, but no earlier entries. This left a window unaccounted for. Investigators left the meeting with more questions than answers. His denial clashed with evidence, and the contrast strengthened their resolve. The case that had lingered was turning toward confrontation. In early 2013, prosecutors authorized an arrest. The combination of DNA, receipts, and inconsistent statements created sufficient grounds. Detectives traveled out of state, coordinated with local law enforcement, and executed the warrant without incident. The community in Maple Hollow learned of the arrest through local news. Headlines described a breakthrough in long unsolved case. Reactions were quiet, marked by relief rather than shock. After years of uncertainty, the story had returned to the surface. Family members spoke briefly to reporters. They expressed gratitude for persistence but avoided speculation. Their comments emphasized patience and trust in the system. Within the town, the arrest reopened memories. Teachers recalled vigils from the late 90s, now tied to a potential resolution. Younger residents who barely remembered Emily read about her case for the first time. Law enforcement held a press conference. The sheriff described the investigation as an example of persistence, crediting evidence preservation. He stressed that the process was not finished. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the case carried momentum backed by formal action. The long wait for answers had moved from possibility to reality. The trial phase now stood ahead. Court proceedings began in late 2013. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. DNA recovered from the victim's clothing, a grocery receipt aligning with her final night, and contradictions in the suspect's timeline. They emphasized the rarity of the DNA match. Experts testified that the probability of error was extremely low. Chain of custody documents showed evidence had been sealed since 1995, reinforcing credibility. The defense countered by questioning potential contamination. They argued that handling of fibers in the 90s lacked today's precision. They also suggested the receipt only proved presence in town, not contact with Emily. Jurors listened as witnesses described the quiet town, the unanswered questions, and the years of waiting. The prosecution stressed patience rewarded by technology, while the defense urged caution about relying too heavily on science. Media coverage remained measured. National outlets mentioned the case briefly, but most attention came from local press. The community followed closely, remembering Emily as more than a headline. The trial balanced precision and restraint. Every exhibit, every timeline detail was weighed. It was not dramatic but deliberate, reflecting the tone of the case itself. The jury carried the responsibility of closing a story 2 decades old. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its decision in 2014. They found the defendant guilty of murder, sentencing him to life imprisonment without parole. The verdict ended years of uncertainty. For Emily's family, it brought quiet relief. They did not hold public celebrations, but attended the hearing with steady presence. Afterward, they issued a brief statement thanking investigators and the court. Within Maple Hollow, the conviction was received with solemn acknowledgement. Community members spoke of closure, but also of lingering sadness. For many, the trial confirmed what they had long suspected, that her death was not an accident, but a crime hidden in plain sight. The defense filed appeals, citing concerns about evidence handling. These were reviewed and denied. The conviction stood firm. The outcome shifted the narrative from mystery to resolution. The unanswered questions had narrowed. A face and a name now occupied the space that once was silence. Though the conviction could not undo loss, it provided an ending consistent with justice. The long process had demanded patience from every corner of the community. With the verdict delivered, Maple Hollow began the process of reflecting on what the case meant. In 2015, the 20th anniversary of Emily's death arrived. The community marked the occasion not only by remembering her, but by creating something lasting. A scholarship in her name was established for students pursuing education degrees. The ceremony was small, held in the school gymnasium where she once taught. Former colleagues, now older, gathered with new teachers and students. Family members attended, speaking briefly about her commitment to children and learning. The scholarship became a way to transform loss into continuity. Each year, a graduating senior would receive support to study teaching. It was a gesture that kept her memory tied to the values she lived. Residents described the event as calm and respectful. There were no large banners or headlines, only a program with her name and a single photograph. For many, it was the first time the younger generation heard her story. The anniversary reminded the town that memory does not vanish with time. It changes form, finding new ways to remain present. Through the scholarship, Emily's influence extended quietly into future classrooms. The community shifted from mourning to legacy, reinforcing that even after decades, one life continued to matter. Local newspapers revisited the case during the anniversary. Journalists framed it as an example of persistence, showing how technology had bridged years of uncertainty. Articles outlined the timeline: the mysterious night in 1995, the years of unanswered questions, the breakthrough with DNA, and the final conviction. Reporters emphasized that without evidence preservation, the outcome would have been different. Editorials described the story as both tragic and instructive. They highlighted the importance of maintaining procedures even when cases seem cold. For young readers, the articles explained how advances in science can reshape old files. Community members interviewed for the pieces spoke of patience. Some recalled vigils from the late 90s. Others remembered how the case had been discussed in schools and churches. The conviction gave those memories structure. The coverage was not sensational. It avoided speculation, focusing instead on lessons. Patience, technology, and persistence were repeated themes. By retelling the story in this way, journalists ensured it remained part of local history. It was no longer just a case file, but a narrative of endurance. The town understood itself better through the lens of what had been endured. By the late 2010s, Maple Hollow had changed. Cotton mills closed, and new housing developments brought families from other regions. The population shifted, yet the memory of Emily's case remained in subtle forms. Long-term residents spoke of her story when explaining the importance of community safety. Teachers mentioned her name when introducing the annual scholarship. For newer residents, the case became part of local history lessons, explained alongside the town's broader changes. Shops, streets, and daily life moved on. Children grew up with little direct connection to the events of 1995, yet reminders surfaced quietly. A plaque in the school library bore her name. Newspaper archives carried the story for anyone who searched. The town's rhythm no longer mirrored the era of cotton and mills, but had adapted to new industries and demographics. Still, Emily's case bridged past and present. For residents, the lasting lesson was not fear, but awareness. They saw how persistence could eventually bring clarity. The story endured not through headlines, but through small acts of remembrance. It became part of the town's identity, shaping how residents understood resilience. Even as the years passed, the memory did not fade entirely.